If you were to look at the Mount Rushmore of Spider-Man comics, you would see the faces of Stan Lee, Steve Ditko, and John Romita Jr. These three men, their unique talents combined, brought to life one of the most enduring fictional representations of a modern hero, the Amazing Spider-Man. For years, their unique blend of humor, pathos, heroics, and wheat cakes would be copied, adapted, and twisted in the pages of The Amazing Spider-Man. Classics like The Night Gwen Stacy Died would serve to turn the whole industry of superhero comics on their head. But eventually, the formula, like anything else, had become just a little bit less special. As enjoyable as Spider-Man comics had always been, there was just something missing from the pages of the comic to make it sing. You know, the way it used to.
The way it used to. But then, Dan, something changed. From the pages of Spectacular Spider-Man, a new talent emerged. Someone with a firm grasp on what made Spider-Man so beloved in the first place, but with a unique take all of his own. And that was writer Roger Stern. Stern's approach to the book found a way to repackage nostalgia like it was brand new and rejuvenated the soul of Spider-Man. His partner in crime, John Romita Jr., a.k.a. JR, completed the perfect creative pairing. Echoing the work of his father while slowly establishing his own artistic voice, the Amazing Spider-Man was back! I always have to say it like that when it comes to Spider-Man being back, right, Dan?
Yeah.
Together, they crafted a fan-favorite run that has stood the test of time. Join us this season on the Amazing Spider Talk as we discover what made this era of comics so special, or as we are calling it, sternly worded.
Hello, I'm Dapper Dan Gavosden, and I own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, including the annuals, which definitely count. And if that includes Monica Rambeau, they really count from this season.
You beat me to the punch, Dan. I was going to say, well, there is a pretty big counting annual in this season that we'll be talking about. Anyway, I'm mischievous Mark Ginocchio. I, too, own every issue of Amazing Spider-Man, including the annuals, including that Monica Rambeau annual, which is, like, inflated in value over the last few months. Thanks, WandaVision. But that annual still doesn't count, in my opinion. I'm sorry. I don't care what you're paying for it on eBay right now. You're overpaying for it because it doesn't count. Why are you paying that much for a comic that doesn't count? Just because she's on TV? Anyway.
Well, thanks, everybody, for joining us for this first episode of Season 5 of the Amazing Spider Talk, the show where two fans and collectors uncover the strange, fun, and fascinating history of the Spider-Man comic universe.
If you want to swing along with us on our journey through Spidey's past, present, and future, subscribe to Amazing Spider Talk on your favorite podcast app. Every other week, we put out a mainline episode of our flagship show, and sprinkled in between, we review new comics as well as interview some of the greatest Spider-Man creators of yesterday and today. This is the perfect time to start listening. I mean, it's always the perfect time, but especially now because it's a season premiere.
Yeah, absolutely. And in this season of the all-new Amazing Spider Talk, we're going to visit the era of Roger Stern and JR, taking a look at, I think, Mark, your and my favorite run of the book ever. It was really, really awesome. And, with the end of Jenny O'Neill's run on Amazing came these two new pairs of creators in the Spider-Man books that I dare say would change the title forever. Readers of Peter Parker's Spectacular Spider-Man already got a sneak preview of Spider-Man's future in the hands of Roger Stern, and here we're going to dive deep head-on into it.
Absolutely. So Roger Stern, who we said in the introduction, he had wrote and plotted 16 issues of Spectacular Spider-Man that quickly earned him the top spot on the Spidey books. In fact, it was Spider editor Tom DeFalco who offered him the role, and it was like he was on the big time. So so we're going to be talking about this run, which is mostly available on Marvel Unlimited, and for the most part, we're going to be covering Amazing Spider-Man issues number 224 to 227. There's a little break, and then 229 to 250, and annuals 15 and 16. And when we say cover, we're talking kind of generally about this era in terms of looking at the quirks and frankly the greatness of Roger Stern and what made this run so ballyhooed. I mean, we're going to be getting into the weeds on some of these these issues more specifically as the season goes along, but. That's where we're going to be in terms of the broad overview of this episode. 224 to 227, 229 to 250, and annuals 15 and 16.
And don't forget to hang around after the show where Mark and I will be taking your questions before we move to a Patreon exclusive discussion of the brand new Amazing Spider-Man Volume 5, number 61. But Mark, let's talk about the Roger Stern run. We've been waiting like a decade to really cover this in this level of detail, and here it is. It's finally arrived. Mark, you're our kind of like historian here of the two of us. Why don't you tell us a little bit about Roger Stern? I know we did that whole episode on his spectacular run, and I don't think he changed much as a person between then and now. And I dare say, I think some of these early Amazing issues feel like they might have been leftover spectacular scripts. But tell us a little bit about like Roger Stern getting this book and kind of some of the history of it.
Yeah, I mean, as we alluded to in our season finale last year, when Stern was writing Spectacular, I mean, he loved it. He loved doing it. He loved Spider-Man. He was always a fan. But Spectacular, he kind of felt it was a tryout, and what were you trying out for? You're trying out to write Amazing. Amazing Spider-Man was the flagship book. It was the big time, as Dan Slott would later call it, when he started writing full time on the book. And I think Stern even referred to Spectacular as kind of like the stepchild of the Spider-Man family. And, that's something against Spectacular, but even with your sense, Dan, which I think is a correct sense that some of these early stories were kind of holdovers, coming onto the main book opened up a whole new level of storytelling for Stern. He didn't have to, I think, wade into the obscure anymore. He was able to just tell the stories the way he wanted to tell them, and he, in his own way, even though he kind of leaned back, and there was, in lots of this run is very nostalgic. I mean, there are certain stamps that were distinctively his own that he put on this book. It's kind of funny. Our good friend of the show, the legendary Tom DeFalco, he was editing the Spider books at the time, when they basically had the group editors that Danny Figueroa had went into last season. And he asked him to join ASM in 1981, and Stern basically was like, "All right, this is it. This is my chance. I'm in the prime time now." But he didn't hesitate. We've talked to various creators over the years about like that step up to Amazing, and their reactions to it. And Stern has said in various interviews over the years that he felt ready because he always felt he had a deep understanding of the character, and frankly, he was a very active scripter and collaborator with his artists. He would actually kind of art direct, it sounds like, his artists in terms of telling them what he felt Spider-Man, especially out of costume, what he should look like and how he should be reacting. So this is somebody, we've heard this from Tom DeFalco, we've heard this from JMD, we've heard this from a bunch of creators over the years. This is just somebody who really put himself inside the head of Peter Parker, and frankly, the stories show, and we'll get into that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I want to talk a little bit about this upgrade from Spectacular to Amazing, because I think it's become something of a, maybe cliche isn't the right word, but maybe an expectation that like people who are working, on the B titles are the next ones in line to get bumped up to the A book. But really, there haven't been many creators who did that. I mean, it might just be that like Bill Mantlo really kind of owned Spectacular for a long time there, and I guess there were a lot of creators that bounced off and on, but Roger Stern to me is like one of the few major examples of someone that really owned that B title and then found themselves elevated to Amazing Spider-Man. Sometimes you get people that would bounce back and forth, like JMD, but like Stern is kind of like the kind of premier example of graduating from Spectacular to Amazing.
Yeah, and it's worth noting that when he was on Spectacular, I mean, yes, the stories weren't as high profile, and he wasn't able to use the high profile characters like the big villains all that much. Not that he really used those villains all that much when he was on Amazing, but we'll
Yeah.
we'll get into what he did with that in that regard. Um, and obviously the artists, it was kind of a rotating shift. I mean, he had Mike Zeck on a few issues, and Marie Severin. I mean, like, it kind of jumped around. But he his run, frankly, is also one of the few where you kind of saw a through line of his stories. Like he told a very specific kind of story. There were certain characters and tropes, I guess you would say, that he brought into his book and that he kind of kept coming back to over and over again on Spectacular. And like in that regard, it truly was a tryout. Like this wasn't like, I mean, I guess Mantlo did it to some degree. I don't want to completely dismiss it. It's not like these other writers didn't tell arcs or stories, but like you kind of just felt like if you look at other runs on Spectacular, you'd have an arc be connected by a couple of issues, but like the book as a whole over the span of a year or two didn't really connect to itself. It just kind of went from one story to the next because it was a very transient book. And Stern, whether he wanted to be in it for the long haul or he saw it as a platform, he and we talked about this last season too. I mean, like he clearly had an idea of how he wanted to tell a long form Spider-Man story. Is this making sense to you, Dan?
Oh, absolutely. Even though I think if there's any critique, and it's not really a critique of him, of his run, is that long form story feels unfinished. Like so many of the
Right.
elements he introduces are really like giant changes for the book that have big ramifications that spill over into the next run, but didn't really get to see full fulfillment in Stern's run. And I think we're going to talk about like how we remember Stern's run and how it is beloved by fans later this episode. But it always has been curious to me because it is a fairly short run, and yet it still retains this kind of like godlike status amongst fans. But you were mentioning that he had a real kind of understanding of the character, even including the art. And I think we can't talk about Stern's run without talking briefly about John Romita Jr. or JRJR and his contributions, because how could you talk about this work without talking about the artist for one, but particularly this artist?
Right. And it's so funny too because this was literally the infancy of John Romita Jr.'s career, and at this point in time, frankly, he kind of was getting hit with some critics with the nepotism tag just because of what a legend his father was. And I think if you hear it from Romita, like that kind of probably took a ding on his confidence at the time, because like compared that to the work he would later do with JMS, or even the stuff he did with like Howard Mackey on Peter Parker Spider-Man in the 90s and stuff like that. I mean, like he, by that point, Romita was, I think, more fully formed as an artist and as a storyteller. And frankly, I think he would even agree with this, was a better visual storyteller. Yet, like he still has a stamp on this run, even if maybe he's not as proud of it as he is his later work. And I think that's key too. And when you read interviews with Stern, I mean, Stern liked working with JR a lot too, even though Stern seemed to have a very specific idea of what he wanted everything just so. I mean, for maybe Stern appreciated the fact that because JR was so young, he can kind of push him in a certain direction. You know what I mean? Like, I wonder how someone like Stern would have worked with either a McFarlane or an Eric Larson. It may not have gone as well.
Well, it's curious. I mean, there's always this ongoing debate about parsing the work between an artist and the writer and what is, whose contribution. But I think, the two of these two working together, there was, for some of the rough panels, like you could probably make fun of JR's characters' foreheads being extra big in some instances. But there's a real intimacy to the storytelling that I think is unique to this run. I think it's really embracing some of the ideas that would become more popular in other 80s comics of the time, like Frank Miller's Daredevil and stuff. And you see this kind of story pacing and new approach to visual storytelling within the book, doing a lot of like punch outs and, knockouts and things like that, and embracing new color theory and I think utilizing the close up a lot more within these books. And I just feel like I guess we could say it's cinematic, even though it's the wrong form. But there was a little bit more to the layouts and how action and characters were showcased on the page, and freer layouts. And, whether that's Stern or JR, and I tend to think it's probably more JR, because Stern is, had been around longer than JR had at the time. The book felt like it's subtle, but there's a difference, and I think it's definitely noticeable within the pages.
Absolutely. Now, in addition to the art form kind of being this fresh, or I should say, the visual style being this fresher thing, like, and it, yes, Roger liked writing Peter a lot, but like the other thing to keep in mind about like this era in this book was, I mean, really reinvigorated the supporting cast. I mean, like suddenly, certainly when compared to Stern's immediate predecessor on the book, which was Denny O'Neil, um, like there were stories where Aunt May was very critical. I mean, they had introduced Nathan Lubensky as her boyfriend, and that created a certain level of drama. Jonah and Robbie and the Bugle were front and center, and we'll get into some of the specifics of that. I mean, heck, there's a whole issue of Jonah having like a fantasy, and he's in his what did I refer to it once on the website? He was in the sweatsuit mafia, his gold sweatsuit. And of course, while not immediately, but getting towards the second half of Stern and JR's run, Mary Jane came back on this book. So the supporting cast was very central to this book in a way it had not been in quite some time. I mean, other predecessors had kind of taken characters off the table, and maybe tried to introduce new ones, but really didn't do much with them. And Stern kind of went back to the well with the classics that Stan Lee had first came up with. But the other thing that, and this is to me always will be a defining thing of Stern's run, and we'll get into it at a whole episode, because we always have to do an episode per season around one of these topics. But the villain. So outside of the Vulture, who was kind of an underutilized Spider-Man villain anyway, prior to this run, Stern avoided using the classic rogues. He decided, no, I don't want to tell a Doc Ock story. I don't need Electro. I don't need to do an Osborn's through line the way others had done. We didn't need a Green Goblin 4. There is a Goblin, but it's a completely different Goblin character. And other villains came from like the Avengers. They came from all sorts of places. The Defenders. We had and it's just very fascinating that he was able to tell distinctively Spider-Man stories in terms of the certain characteristics and traits of the character that have gone on to define him, and frankly that we lean back on to say this is a definitive Spider-Man story because it captures this essence of these traits, and it's not a Spider-Man versus Doc Ock story or a Spider-Man versus the Sandman or any of that. You know what I mean? Like it shows you how much he understood the character and how he could still tell distinctive Spider-Man stories without having to lean on the villain cast. But in terms of the supporting cast, those were the OGs, and I always found that little needle that he threaded to be quite interesting.
I always found it interesting that the kind of like two most celebrated modern or critically celebrated modern Spider-Man runs are both runs that really don't feature his villains or his regular
Right.
cast of villains, and that maybe there's something to that. And yeah, it's funny. It's the only time that like Doctor Octopus was relegated to a B book. Right? He was all throughout spectacular. Right. Yeah, that's great. But I mean, yeah, I tend to think that the kind of like other people's villains are fun and if not forgettable, but who could forget, his greatest creation, or at least I think in my eyes, Roger Stern's greatest creation and the new stuff that he brought to the book. And to me, that's the Hobgoblin. I mean, how could you forget him?
I mean, if only he got to uncover his identity the way he wanted to, and then it would have just saved me years worth of misery and boring our audience with hunting for the story behind the story, right? I mean, like, come on. But no, I mean, obviously the Hobgoblin, and it's so funny, like, it is still a goblin story, but it was done in a very unique way, kind of capturing the elements that you had talked about earlier, Dan, in terms of like the cinematic qualities and all that. I mean, it really felt kind of fresh and edgy, for lack of a better word, despite the fact that it was just another goblin story. But I mean, yeah, I would say that's definitely his greatest creation. I mean, other creations in terms of characters that he brought back. I mean, well, that he introduced to the world. I mean, there's the this is a bit of a cheat, but it's certainly something that gets referenced a lot. There's the kid who collects Spider-Man. The kid himself. Now his name is escaping me.
Tim Harrison.
Thank you, Dan. I knew you would have it right, ready to go. Tim Harrison. The other creation that Stern gets credit for, although Tom DeFalco had a role in it and Jim Shooter had a role in it, was the black suit. And apparently Stern was the one who kind of, as he was leaving the book, said, the suit should be alive. That's he gets credit for that. I mean, he didn't come up with an alien symbiote that would become Venom, but that the suit should be alive was enough. You know what I mean? that got you part of there. And then, as we alluded to in our intro, the other big character creation, and this was something that, because Stern was also, keep in mind, writing the Avengers at this time, and this Avengers run is is considered one of the great Avengers runs. It's just this, totally boggles your mind that someone could be writing both Spider-Man and the Avengers and be basically doing like modern greatness on both. But that's Captain Marvel 2. Monica Rambeau, and that's like at the time maybe not as big of a deal, but certainly after the Captain Marvel movie a couple years ago and now WandaVision, that this is a sought after character, and one that's probably going to get a lot of play in the MCU going forward. So congratulations, Roger Stern. You just made yourself some money with that one.
Or maybe not, unfortunately.
Or maybe not. That's a good point. Yeah, maybe I shouldn't speak so soon.
Yeah, well, hey, that's a great little overview of Roger Stern. Let's talk about what we're calling Sternisms. Like, what are the things that kind of define Roger Stern and his run? Could we pick out a Roger Stern comic? If it was handed to us off the rack, what are some of the things we'd be looking for to distinguish it?
Yeah, I mean, I think when I look at it from the big picture, it's like, what makes it a Roger Stern comic, and would I be able to pick it out? And I would probably be able to, because it's like, it's basically like less hokey schmaltzy Stan Lee. You know what I mean? Like, and that's nothing against the great Stan Lee, but I mean, frankly, like, you know, Stan, especially when, once Ditko had left the book, I think Stan kind of leaned a little too much into the schmaltz sometimes, whereas Stern was kind of nerdy and fun and hokey, but like there was a little bit more, I feel, substance and I don't want to say intelligence because that's insulting, but you know what I mean. There was a little more depth to his characters and his stories, and maybe some of Stan's stories towards the end of his run on the book in the 60s and 70s there.
It did.
But
His
like,
writing didn't quite have the pop that Stan Lee's writing has. There's not the alliterative words or
right,
the clever turns of phrases. It's very economical writing. It's emotion first, and logic, and allowing the art to speak a little bit more than I think Stan ever did with his. I mean, it was a different era, and seeing panels drowned in balloons, can happen in Stern's run, but I think he was a finer craftsman, if you will.
right. No, I would agree with that wholeheartedly, and we've already talked about this a bunch, but like, I think the big thing was how it wasn't just the fact that he liked to be inside Peter's head, but it was also how he was inside Peter's head. Like there was like um, this kind of balance of Peter's love hate relationship with Spider-Man, and his, and basically the fact that he was Spider-Man, that um, frankly I don't think anyone but Stan Lee has ever played with great lengths. I mean, yes, we there are certain, there are certain Peter Parker isms, his ability to kind of balance his life, and the curse of Spider-Man, as Sam Raimi kind of made it out to be in his movies in the 2000s. But this was different because it's like, you know the Peter maybe didn't love the fact that he was Spider-Man because of the burdens and the responsibility that came with it, but um, and maybe it was because Stern himself was in awe of the character. But like they were this whole run has so many moments where Peter is like mid-action and he's kind of stopping and saying to himself, "That's right, I can do this because I'm Spider-Man. I have the proportionate strength and speed of a spider. I am blessed that these things." I mean, in one of his fights with Hyde, Mr. Hyde and Cobra, he even says, "It's times like this I feel blessed I was bitten by that little radioactive spider." And it's like, it's that kind of like appreciation and awe and self congratulatory attitude that is that kind of plays with the Stan Lee schmaltzy salesmanship of the character. But Stern, I think Stern did it because he truly appreciated who this character was, and again, like, understood it, like, like Spider-Man was not a pushover. Like he had these abilities and these powers, and he was extraordinary because of them.
One of the things I also like about the run is that he really is sure to emphasize the power of Spider-Man. I mean, this is
Yeah.
a character that can lift tons of weight over his head, depending on whose version of the character you're reading. And I feel like Stern was like the first one in a while to really embrace the pure raw power that Spider-Man has. I mean, even if he put him up against an unstoppable foe like the Juggernaut, you still always had a sense of Spider-Man's innate strength, and the time of pulling his punches was kind of in the past, and I always loved that because I feel like Spider-Man's strength oscillates so wildly, where he has trouble fighting one dude that's punching him in one instant, and in another instant he's lifting thousands of pounds of metal off of his head, and I feel like Stern operated towards the kind of like stronger end of that spectrum and used kind of stories like the one against Tarantula to really emphasize that, like, hey, he really shouldn't have trouble fighting a guy like Tarantula.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, like, I mean, even in the very famous Juggernaut. I mean, yes, Juggernaut overwhelms him, but that's because Juggernaut is basically being portrayed in the story as one of the most powerful villains in the Marvel universe, and like I think part of what adds to, and we'll obviously as the season goes along get into the specifics of the story, but part of what adds to the drama of it is the fact that it's not like Spider-Man is throwing like cotton balls at Juggernaut trying to stop him. I mean, like he's doing the heavy lifting here, and it's not making a dent. That's the point. It's like like he is throwing his full strength out there, and it's impressive, and yet it's still not enough. And like in the Cobra Hyde story that I had mentioned a few minutes ago, I mean, like Mr. Hyde is not a pushover either. Um, and Spider-Man is kind of having this moment where he's like, "That's right, I don't have to pull my punches here." And then once he unloads, he does knock Hyde out pretty. I don't want to say easily, but like he takes care of it. But like this is a guy that has held his own against members of the Avengers and stuff like that. So it's kind of like, all right, like when Spider-Man fully uncorks, he can he can do some real damage here, and that's kind of the point of the character. He's a superhero, like he should be able to do some. It's not. I mean, that's always been the kind of the allure of Spider-Man. It's not just speed and agility. I mean, he's a powerhouse too.
Yeah, and he's like good at his job too. He's not like the kind of man child that some writers like to approach Peter as. Although Peter also is a deeply flawed person. There are a number of turns in this run, like him leaving grad school, that show him kind of outclassed by his life situations. And that's another big part of this story. I think, like we talked about Denny O'Neil's run, I feel like he didn't really understand the strength of Spider-Man, but he also really didn't understand the supporting cast and how that work-life balance is such a big part of the character. And for Stern, I think, as much as Stan understood that, like, it was really Peter Parker's story that we were reading in the pages of this book.
Oh, 100%. I mean, and yes, there some things had changed in terms of this, members of the supporting cast, in terms of who was there and who was around. But like, frankly, similar to the whole situation to the villains, like that didn't necessarily matter in terms of what Stern was trying to get across in his narrative. I mean, like, um, you know, he had used like the Empire State University teaching grad work as a really clever way to show how Peter struggled with interpersonal relationships. I mean, basically, he's just as smart and capable of all these other grad students that he was working alongside, but like, frankly, they don't respect him because he's either not there or he's cutting out early or poor Deb Whitman is just giving him the ice stare because, he just blew her off for dates too many times during the Denny O'Neil run. So I guess now it's like time to pull the plug on that. I mean, there's there's a moment in Amazing Spider-Man 232 where Peter misses his own surprise party at Empire State. Um, and like you would also see these interpersonal relationships and with the classic supporting cast. I mean, obviously Aunt May comes along, but that comes to mind. But frankly, even Aunt May had the unique wrinkle of Nathan Lubetsky, and granted, I think it was Tom DeFalco and Ron Frenz that would tell the ultimate story with Peter and his responsibility, and as it related to Nathan. But um, having this new character be so close to someone Peter loves so much created a new sense of drama and tension with Peter and Spider-Man and how it relates to these characters. I mean, like, one breath it's like, oh, now that May's found somebody, I don't have to worry as much from her. But like, he's worrying for two. It's like it's never clean for people. It just can't be. That's the point.
And I think this run actually like marks a real change for Aunt May. I feel like around issue 200 with the burglar and the old home and her being kidnapped and all that stuff is when she kind of like, if there's a pendulum in terms of MJ or Aunt May's portrayal and her age and how frail she is. I think 200 is probably like a hard swing one way on the pendulum towards Aunt May being kind of like her most frail, or kind of the peak of her kind of being portrayed in this particular way, whether it's the kind of like absent-minded, confused woman that's marrying Doc Ock, or someone truly on death's door. But here, Stern takes her from being in this old folks' home, assisted living, to positioning her to move back to Forest Hills to open her own home to care for other senior citizens, and it gives her a little more agency and a little more strength as a character of someone who's doing her own thing and not just waiting for Peter to call her. And I think you start seeing that character be kind of slowly start to become the kind of more independent Aunt May that we're used to seeing in the comics today, where she, is, I don't know, like her early 60s and is running Feast and doing all these things. I don't think you get that Aunt May without someone starting to kind of like turn the clock back just a little bit on Aunt May's bizarre, whatever you want to call it, aging schedule that she's on.
Yeah, it's true. Do you want to talk a little bit about kind of playing off this, the interpersonal relationship and Peter, how people saw Peter, but also how people saw Spider-Man in this run, because I think that was a key thing that Stern had brought back. It's funny, like one of the big status quo shifts when Marv Wolfman took over the book was he absolves Peter from the murder of Norman Osborn. That was kind of like this thing hanging over his head. But frankly, like I feel like in doing so, we kind of got away from one of the core attributes of Spider-Man that goes all the way back to the very first issue of Amazing Spider-Man, which is the fact that the public didn't trust Spider-Man and didn't like Spider-Man, and Stern really leaned into that. I mean, part of that was bringing back the Bugle in a big way, and JJ and Robbie. I mean, JJ was just you could tell Stern loved writing Jonah. I mean, who doesn't? But I mean, he in a way that we hadn't seen probably since again the Stan Lee era. But there were like even these little nuances. Like I love in the issue with the Fool Killer, and let it be said, and we'll do this in our villains episode. But you look at a character like the Fool Killer, and it's like, what does he do? He kills fools, and you're kind of like, how can you tell a competent story out of that concept? And yet he did. You know what I mean? It's like this is a fun story, and this guy comes across as a big threat here. But he Spider-Man is fighting the Fool Killer, and inside Empire State, and he like messes up this like random professor's office, and afterwards, like the person that basically Spider-Man saves, he's like, "Yeah, thanks for messing up my office, you menace." And it's like, again, like I mean, this is the thing. You didn't see this a lot in the years immediately preceding when Stern came back on the book, but like Stan would do this all the time, and Jerry Conway to a lesser extent. This sense that Spider-Man and Peter just couldn't win. Like they could maybe win the fight, but there would always be a cost. Like it didn't always have to be the life of his uncle, but like something would always be. He could never be 100% up. Something had to come down. It's just there was no other way to do it. So in this case, it was just his reputation. Like he could save this guy. and save his life, and it still wasn't enough. Or like, during a fight where Lance Bannon is there shooting for the Daily Bugle. Now, Lance Bannon was kind of like the new nemesis for Peter Parker at the Bugle. I guess, kind of the curmudgeon, the crooked photographer, or I shouldn't say crooked, but he just, he was always out to kind of one up Peter.
Right, he's the rival photographer.
The rival, thank you. He Spider-Man during the fight, like he wrecks Lance's camera, and of course, like Lance is like, "You bum, you ruined my camera." Like it's like no one has respect for this character, despite the fact that, as we earlier mentioned, he's extraordinarily powerful. He does good. He saves the day, but it will not earn him respect because the public just does not like Spider-Man, and that is, I think, something that writers struggle to capture in this comic over the years, because frankly it's like, who wants to write a superhero who nobody likes? But that's kind of key for Spider-Man, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, I'm glad you mentioned that the same was true for Peter, because I think in terms of like dumping on Peter, this run has it in spades. My favorite of which being the reintroduction of Mary Jane, where we've got Peter kissing another woman, Amy, as MJ turns the key and opens the door in the same fashion as she introduced herself all the way back in issue 42, and the sight is very different. And, it's not Peter's fault in any regard, but there are so many moments where Peter just cannot catch a break in this run. And I don't know what it is about us that we love watching our heroes and our non-costumed heroes get beat up on so much. But, it is delightful to read in the pages of these books.
Right. It's that old relatability factor. I think that, frankly, that's just how we all feel about life sometimes. It's very rarely all up for us, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So you've mentioned that, obviously, and we're going to do a whole episode on the villains of this run like we always do each season. But, one of the things over the years that, you kind of notice when you cover books like these or read through books like these is when another person's villain comes in, or another rogue from another villain, our hero comes into a book like Amazing Spider-Man. The problem can often be that the hero adapts to meet the villain, not the other way around. And so you have books that just don't feel like Spider-Man books, or he's fighting. I don't know. Stiltman is okay, but I can think of a number of I guess the Fire Lord issue, even though I quite like that issue. I think that still feels like a Spider-Man issue. I guess I'm having a hard time pulling one out of my back pocket right now, but.
Well, I mean, I hate to keep dumping on it, but the entire Denny O'Neil run, frankly,
Yeah.
I mean, it was just there were these predicament. I mean, it wasn't necessarily a specific villain, but it was filled with these predicaments and dramatic moments for Spider-Man that just didn't, like you said, they didn't feel like they were written to meet Spider-Man. It was like Spider-Man was being written. It's like, oh, he's got to solve this caper or break himself out of jail, and it was just like, this could be any hero. It didn't, it wasn't being written for Spider-Man. It was being written for the scenario, not the other way around. And is that what you're trying to say? I would,
yeah, exactly. And yet, when I read Stern's run, even though none of Spider-Man's rogue gallery is really featured, I mean, there's the Vulture, and if you count Willow the Wisp and Tarantula, but
Tarantula.
There are very few A-listers, and I think there are people that would probably push back on the Vulture being an A-lister, although he's in a movie, so I'm gonna count him.
Right.
And yet all of these stories to me, even the one with the Fool Killer, feel like Spider-Man stories. What do you think makes that work for Stern? How did he pull that off?
Well, I think it came back to what you were just saying at the start of of this segment, which was that Stern whoever Stern was using, he took the scenario and was like, how can I apply this to Spider-Man? You know, like what do we, you know, I don't want to just use some random Avengers guy or X-Men guy because they're cool characters. I need them to fit into Spider-Man's universe. And actually, you know, his most famous non-Spider-Man of all time, arguably, is of course no one can stop the Juggernaut. And you know, we're going to talk about this story until we're sick of it, frankly, this season, because you know, as I said to Tom Brevoort, it's probably my favorite Spider-Man story. But interestingly enough, in Roger Stern's interview to Tom DeFalco, in a great book of interviews that DeFalco put out years ago, highly recommended, by the way. He actually said that the Juggernaut story was initially, in his mind, conceived as a Doc Ock story. And he opted against it because he was like, you know, Doc Ock's played out. I want to use somebody different. But he's like, he thought Doc Ock because he's like, I need someone who's a real powerhouse that can just basically, in his words, beat the snot out of Spider-Man so much that he would just basically put him on the brink of collapse so that the comeback moment would be, you know, truly worth it. And, you know, that was the premise. So it was like, okay, well, he wanted to push Peter or Spider-Man to the brink so he can mount this huge comeback. So let's find the villain that works in that scenario. Not, I have Juggernaut, let's write Spider-Man fighting Juggernaut. You know, I think he told the story, you know, with Spider-Man first in mind. And you know, when you look at even some of these other ones with like Fool Killer or Cobra and Hyde, you know, like there's like these elements like Peter's his sympathy for you know, the Fool Killer, like, even though this guy has this gun that he's zapping people with and basically incinerating them, it's kind of horrifying that there's this villain going around doing this. You know, Spider-Man towards the end is like, he's sick. This poor guy is sick and he needs help. And you know, he can't help him, but like he feels bad, and like you know, like, frankly, that's something that has always kind of been like a weakness of Spider-Man's. It's this idea of like, you know, like maybe his sympathy for characters, like, I mean, we're talking about this right now in the Nick Spencer run. His sympathy for like Norman and Harry Osborn has kind of opened the door to all this trouble for him. But like Stern really wanted to. He told these stories, but he needed to make sure that Peter's personality always shined through.
And I feel like he did a pretty good job of integrating a lot of these villains into Peter's life in some way. I mean, Juggernaut's a bad example because Juggernaut and Spider-Man really have no kind of personal connection in that story. He's just a guy on a mission and Spider-Man's trying to stop him. I guess Madam Web is the kind of like personal connection in that she is she's the stakes of that issue. Right. But you're right. That Fool Killer issue, I think, is really interesting for that it is a classmate of Peter's that's been seeded for quite some time. That's the one story to me that feels like it was a hangover thread from Spectacular that he wanted to wrap up.
Right.
But he makes it work in the pages of Amazing for whatever the difference between the titles are. Right. Being that they're both 28 pages of comics or what have you. You know, and I think, you know, if he didn't, you know, take other people's villains and make them great, you know, he had really compelling villains of his own creation, you know, obviously the Hobgoblin, and that was deeply personal because he's so afraid that the Hobgoblin is going to gain access to his secret identity and how that will impact him again, and he can't have a repeat of Gwen Stacy. And, you know, that's one other thing that Roger Stern is really good at, and I think we said this in our Spectacular episode, is that he's clearly a Spider-Man nerd. This guy knows every inch of the character's history, but he doesn't drop it like you got to go check out this issue. He weaves it so expertly into like a grander tapestry of a character with history and weight behind him. And for me, the Hobgoblin works as a villain because he's leveraging all of that weight that has been built up prior, and he just has a cool design and has a cool story, and we'll talk more about the Hobgoblin.
Absolutely. No, and frankly, like, and this kind of brings us into this other big Sternism, which would kind of, frankly, follow Stern after his initial run on this book, which was, I feel like Roger Stern was second to none in answering a question that no one actually was asking about Spider-Man. Because I think, again, it was because of his appreciation for the character, his kind of nerdiness about the history of the character. I mean, I guess you can make a case that maybe Stan Lee was like this too, but not Stan Lee. Well, yes, Stan Lee was like this too, but I was thinking more currently, like Dan Slott you might say was kind of did this from time to time. But when you think of a lot of Stern's great stories, they're kind of coming in response to a question that no one really asked, like the big one. He loved the Vulture. He loved the Vulture. He felt like the Vulture was this like perfect counterbalance to Spider-Man in terms of his youthfulness and his intelligence, that he was going to kind of pair him off with this cunning old character. But one of the things that we never got, despite the fact that the Vulture was the second major villain that Spider-Man fought in his comics, was an origin story. And Stern basically years later came up with an origin for Vulture because he just asked a question aloud, which was, wait a second, what happened to Adrian Toomes to make him like this? Like, it's not just enough that he went to the tinkerer and got a costume, like this has to be more to it. And he ends up telling this story about this guy. He was an inventor and an entrepreneur, and his partner screwed him over, and that's what made him this miserable criminal. And the same could be said for our favorite, the Hobgoblin. I mean, in addition to Stern answering his own question about who the Hobgoblin was years later, I mean, the whole premise of the Hobgoblin was like, what would happen if someone, like we had established during the Stan Lee run that Norman Osborn had lairs hidden throughout the city. And Stern basically asked the question, well, what would happen if someone found one?
If the wrong person opened the wrong broom closet, you get the exactly. Hobgoblin.
Yeah. I mean, and things like Jonah, and frankly, the multiple times he did things that were, frankly, criminal in his efforts to subdue Spider-Man, whether it be hiring the Spider Slayers or the Scorpion. Like he that became a whole storyline towards the end of Stern's run of, well, what would happen if someone had that information about Jonah, and used it to blackmail him? Like what would come from that? And these are all, I can't, I mean, granted you weren't even born yet, and I was barely alive when these stories first came out, but like, I can't imagine that there was like this call from fans, like, we need to know what would happen to Norman Osborn's lair, or why hasn't Jonah ever gotten busted for funding the Scorpion? But like, Stern, I think, had a legitimate curiosity and love for the character and wanted to explore these otherwise forgotten elements, and it ended up leading to some of the best stories he ever wrote. And that's, I think that really needs to be applauded. I mean, like, that's like true fandom there, like it's true fandom meets true artistry to tell a great story.
Well, what I love about it is that he treats the world like it's a real place that exists, and that history has an impact on the characters without making it like mining too deep. And I think the creators before then had done similarly, but I do think that a lot of these things are long simmering payoffs to how the real world, so to speak, would react to things like this. And thinking of like a modern example of this would be the first issue of Nick Spencer's run, where a bunch of, things that probably should have been addressed suddenly became consequential in some way, or had consequences to them. Whether I think Nick Spencer has followed through on that is something altogether different, and still to be seen. But I think Roger Stern, to me, this is just like him as a fan, or just a writer looking at this and saying there's these big unanswered things that need to be addressed, and why don't I come up with a brand new good story with them? I mean, speaking of JJ's blackmail, or JJJ's blackmail, I think it's one of the all-time best sequences with the character. That you have a character that's typically written like a buffoon, and boy, Stern loved writing buffoon Jonah, but he also could write that I cover the waterfront version of Jonah, the reputable reporter who is willing to give up his job to release the truth, even if it only really is sparked by being blackmailed, which Spider-Man is quick to call him out on, which is like, you wouldn't be this truthful if you weren't being blackmailed.
Right.
But Spider-Man gives him a back door to take to get out of the situation, which is interesting for Spider-Man to kind of bail out Jonah. And Jonah doesn't take it. And I think it's one of the more noble instances of the character, and very different from the moment where he's like, well, I'm not going to be the editor anymore. I'm going to be the publisher.
What a sacrifice.
Yeah, exactly. Well, great. I hope that was a pretty good overview for everybody of like what, some of the highlights of the Stern run were. But why don't we talk about our Spider Slack, Mark?
Absolutely. Well, hundreds of listeners like you hang out in our community of Spider-Man fans on Slack. The amazing Spider Slack community is absolutely free to join, and you can jump into active conversations with awesome people about collecting, conventions, movies, new comics, old comics, and more.
Yeah, I'm there all the time. Just this week, we're always talking about the new comics and old comics, but like it's been a collecting game recently. The '90s are back, and everybody is buying up comics by the truckload, and it's been fun I'm re-engaging my collecting hat in the Slack, so that's been a lot of fun. So if you want to join our awesome Spider-Man community, think of it like an online forum, but more fun and friendly. Just follow the link in the description and be sure to say hi. And once you're there, be sure to let us know what you think of this new episode in the new season. We'd love to hear from you guys. All right, Mark. So to conclude this episode, I really wanted to kind of just have a general discussion with you about the Stern run. We had said that the Stern run is so beloved with fans, and I think you can see the response from our community. People are really excited about this season. It's the one they've been waiting for the whole time. Maybe because they know that you and I love it so much. But like, what is it about this run? Like, there's a lot of good things about it. But again, like I said, it's really short. It doesn't feature a lot of the classic villains. But what is it that makes this run so beloved with the fans? And is that the same thing as just like the quality of the book, like the writing quality?
I mean, I think a lot of it has to do, yes, I mean, the writing and the art are obviously of a very high quality, but I also think something that we don't really see a lot of with many runs is the consistency of this run too. I mean, like, there are plenty of great creators who've worked on this title who, like, you kind of like say, oh, well, yeah, they were great, but that story was kind of cringe. You know what I mean? I mean, like, love Jerry Conway, but like, Mindworm and Grizzly, or JMS and this Sins Past, or JMD and the Clone Saga. I mean, on and on. I mean, Stern really, I mean, you could maybe say, oh, well, some stories are better than others, and that's fair. But like, there is no like dud in this run. I mean, like each story has qualities and merits to it, even when frankly it shouldn't. Like, I mean, like, again, that Fool Killer story comes to mind. Like that is a comic that I think in a lesser creator's hands is totally forgettable and stupid, for lack of better things. It's like how are we using this guy? Come on.
Even when the when he's repeating himself, I think it's good. Like I think that the Thunderball story, that's the first part of The Kid Who Collects, is largely like a repeat of Nothing Can Stop the Juggernaut, and yet it's still full of character and really fun. And maybe a lot of that is JR. But like even when he's relying on the old faithful, reliable punch 'em ups, there's something charming about the way he handles the stories.
Yeah, 100%. So I mean, like, there's a consistency element, and I think when you combine that with the fact that, like, here is a guy that um, is not embarrassed by his fandom and adoration for the character, and I think that means something as a fan, as a reader, like, you don't want to be reading something that maybe the person writing it or drawing it is embarrassed to be writing or drawing, or is trying to hide it in some way, or is trying to, like, well, maybe not hide it, but like, I don't want to embrace the old way of doing things. I want to, I have to put my edge on it. And I don't think, Stern put his stamp on things, but I don't think he ever tried to put an edge on anything here. Like, I think, if anything, um, there's a lot of reverence and respect for what came before it. Like, he wasn't trying to dismiss or sweep under the rug anything that had came before it. I mean, he actually went hunting to uncover things that maybe people weren't hunting for, and I think that's all what plays into why this run is beloved. At least it's why I love it. Like, I never feel self-conscious reading a Roger Stern Spider-Man comic, and that is not always the case with others, frankly.
And I agree with you. And I think what's surprising to me, and maybe it shouldn't be, is, and I guess this speaks to the quality of comic book readers. I mean, we're a unique audience, right? And I'm the first to get into a bunch of fights with a bunch of different comic readers about things, or saying that people are reading something wrong, which I try not to say. But that this run sits so fondly in people's memories is really kind of surprising to me. Not because I'm surprised by like their response to the quality of it, or that I don't think it's a quality run. It's that the qualities of it to me are subtle but important, and it's the quiet efficiency of his stories, and like the economy of the storytelling, that it's nothing is overwritten or underwritten. There's a perfect balance between the writing and the art and all the different elements of Spider-Man's life. And each one of those things is small, but it adds up, and it really makes the quality that much better. I mean, the Hobgoblin's a big foe, but like the main bulk of the Hobgoblin mystery really doesn't take place in this run. This run kind of just kicks it off. I think a lot of what people remember from the Hobgoblin mystery took place during like the DeFalco Friends run and onward, because that's where the mystery really kind of like everyone becomes a suspect in that run. And I guess the Juggernaut story is a two-parter that's really hard to forget, and is unstoppable in your memory, so to speak. But there aren't like big events or big like twists for the character in this run. There's no burglar trying to, for 10 issues, find his way back into the house. There's no death of a major supporting cast character. In terms of like all-time Spider-Man moments, I think that here they're quieter. I mean, Juggernaut's huge, but I think Kid Who Collects is, rereading it this week, or I guess last week, I think it might be like, if not my favorite Spider-Man story, in my top 3. And it's so emotionally powerful. And if you'd ask me like, what's the biggest Spider-Man moment of them all? Like, I think maybe him leaving, and revealing his identity to Tim is one of them, and it's quiet. And I think that's the big thing about Stern. And I'm so glad that it's recognized, because I think it could very easily be forgotten. Is that sometimes it's the quiet uh, workmanship and the craft that often goes invisible that really makes something better. And Stern to me is the master of it in Spider-Man. Even if the run is short, and maybe that's also the secret to the success is it didn't keep going. You know, it was just long enough to linger in your mind and have you want to read more, but didn't go overboard. To me, I'm just glad that fans recognize it, whether they've been told to recognize it or not. The quality, I think, speaks for itself.
Yeah, I mean, but that's the thing. I mean, like fans fans live to disagree with each other, Dan, and yet I think this is one of the few non-controversial runs of Spider-Man comics out there. You know, like there's not a lot. I mean, we've been doing this show now for 8 years.
Yeah,
I'm
eight
like trying to
years.
remember. 8 years, and I have, in this community, I have like you have kind of pushed back on some ideas over the years, but like no, I've never heard someone try and be contrary about this run. And yeah, I mean, like you said, like is it hive mind? It might be, but I don't think that's the case. I think there's very little not to like about this. Is like you said, there's just um, just a lot of nuanced yet important stuff that comes through. And yes, there are no big deaths, there are no big events in it, but like everything that is important about it and memorable about it are are unquestionable Spider-Man moments. Like they're moments that capture the essence of who this character is, and that is why, to me, it is on a pedestal. I think, speaking of hive mind, I have to put Ditko and Lee's run over it just because it is the foundation for everything that followed. But if gave me a universe where Ditko and Lee, for some reason, didn't exist, but we had this fully formed Spider-Man character, and I had to judge who did the best job with it, I would put this one at top.
Awesome. I'm curious, rereading it for this show. I mean, uh, were there any new discoveries that you kind of had? I mean, I know for me, every time I reread it, it sits a little bit differently with me, and I guess that comes with age and with reading more comics. Does it? I mean, you love it. Obviously, you would place it number two, so it still sits fondly in your memory. But like, what kind of new things do you glean from it? Upon like rereading it.
It's funny. I mean, like you, every time I read Kid Who Collects, I love that story more and what it represents. And that's true for this time. I think one of the things I really, really grabbed onto this time around, and I talked about it earlier, was kind of like Peter's Peter's sympathy and empathy for other characters, even the villain. Like this is somebody that doesn't ever want to intentionally harm someone, and we've kind of like seen it portrayed in No One Dies and the No Kill Code and all this kind of stuff. But that's the thing, like he doesn't emote in such grandiose terms here, but at the same token, that point still comes across here during this run that like he doesn't want to ever truly intentionally harm somebody. Do no harm is kind of his one of his first uh, mantras here. So like that kind of came forward to me a bit more. But no, I mean that's the thing. Like the run itself, any kind of new wrinkles are very subtle. It's not like this huge discovery of, oh, I never realized before, and now totally changes how I see the character. I don't truly ever get that from rereading these comics.
For me, my kind of, and I don't know if it's a discovery, but like the thing that stood out to me the most this time rereading it is how Peter centric this run is. Like how much Stern writes Peter to be the driving force of every issue of the comic, even if he's reacting to someone else's actions. And, this is not meant to be a knock on more modern writers, but I do think that a lot of that has kind of evaporated. And here, like, Peter really is at the heart of every scene. I can't think of many scenes, I guess except for the Hobgoblin issues where we spend plenty of time with the villains and their plans. It's often Peter doing something that's interrupted, whether he's at the Bugle or, doing something with his friends who are all kind of reintroduced here in classic style. And I think maybe that's what makes the Hobgoblin introduction issue so special is that, like, we do see some of the villain stuff and it's shrouded in mystery and things like that. But even when you get scenes like Jonah and Harry going to the kind of gentleman's club to have a meeting with the Hobgoblin in that great scene where ultimately it was Daniel Kingsley putting on a performance with Roderick in the audience, Peter is invited there, and we often leave the room where Peter goes to sneak into the restroom instead of staying and observing that scene. Peter is always doing something, and that's what made it so exciting for me. Is I felt like I was reconnecting to that character, who, like you said, he's kinder in this book. There's not that sharp edge to Peter that some people kind of play up. I think he's genuinely motivated by empathy for others in the pages of this book, enough to put his life on the line. And it doesn't feel forced or like he's making a proclamation about great power and great responsibility unless it's really necessary. It's just who he is, and he's not showboating or anything like that. And I just kind of appreciated the character the most this time in my read through.
Awesome.
Well, hey,
Well, then,
let's talk a little bit more about some of the things behind the scenes of our show. So, if you find this show entertaining and valuable, please consider supporting us on the Patreon. That is our, way of kind of keeping the podcast going.
Yeah, we can only bring you this content with the support of our Patreon members, and we owe the show's success to every single one of them. We are constantly making exclusive content for our members. This week, Patreon members will hear Dan and my review of Amazing Spider-Man number 61, the debut of a new Spider-Man costume.
Yeah, it's awesome. So why not take that $3.99 that you might have spent on a new comic, or maybe you just had sitting around in your pocket, and put it towards a month subscription to support this show and start receiving our Patreon content. That way you'll hear our Patreon exclusive review podcast on every new issue of Amazing Spider-Man the same week it comes out, instead of waiting for it to arrive in our public podcast feed. And hey, you might feel good about yourself helping us out.
You might. I mean, who can say no to that? Also, if you contribute $10 a month, you can gain access to exclusive artwork from famous Spider-Man artists, commissioned exclusively for our members. This season, we'll be mailing out a print of Spider-Man fighting Dr. Octopus as his friends look on, drawn by official Marvel artist Federico Vincentini in colors and inks. Plus, every episode we release a new episode-specific desktop background created for us by artist Nick Cagnetti for our patrons to enjoy.
Yeah, and I think you guys are going to love that print, those of you who are on board with that. I just shared the rough of it with Mark, and I think it's super cool. But
it is choice, my friend.
Yeah, we know this, though, that this is a hard time for everybody, as it is for us, too. So we appreciate anyone who supports the show just by listening and sharing. But if you do have the means, please join our Patreon to support our continued existence of the show. Just follow the link in the description, and thank you again to all the members who already make this show possible.
But alas, Dan, it is that time for all good things to come to an end. So we want to say thank you to you, the listeners and viewers, for tuning in to this episode of The Amazing Spider Talk.
Yeah, this episode was edited by Rick Coast with production support from Andy Myers. Our artwork comes handcrafted by artists Ron Friends, Sal Buscema, Ray Sumser, and Nick Cagnetti. Our theme songs were produced by Rylan Bojack and Spider Madge. Plus, our introduction animation and musical stinger comes from Josh Sutton from the YouTube show Panels to Pixels.
I just banged my mic dead. I am so sorry. We needed the whole show, and I finally banged it. Well, that was something. Also, this was a lot of fun, Dan. But what's coming next on our episode?
Well, Mark, here it is, drum roll, but don't actually do it, Mark.
Because I'll probably bang my microphone again.
Well, Mark, I think you know what's next because we couldn't be more excited to announce it for you all. So here goes nothing. Next episode, we'll be joined by John Romita Jr. himself to discuss his work on Spider-Man during the Roger Stern run. So, Mark, we are so excited to have him joining us, and we hope all of you will join us for this amazing interview. Mark, can you believe it? John Romita Jr. is on our show.
Yeah, it was pretty wild, but I mean, also, yeah, totally gracious and just a wonderful interview. I mean, I'm not just saying this because it's John Romita Jr., who is an all-time great, but like, frankly, Dan, he was probably one of the best interviews we ever had on the show, I would say, right? I mean, like, it's hard to match just the thoughtfulness and just general sense of himself and where he lies in the universe, in our universe, that he brought to the table here.
Well, I hope you guys will tune in 2 weeks to hear that show because I think you're really going to enjoy it, and we had a lot of fun with it. I'm still pinching myself a little bit to make sure it happened, but I have it recorded, so I know for a fact that it is a thing that existed. So yeah, absolutely awesome, and we hope you guys will tune in for that. So, also, if you are tuning in live, don't forget, as soon as the show ends, the conversation continues with our audience on YouTube. And if you missed out on Amazing Spider Talk Live this time, we'll be back soon on YouTube. So go there and subscribe and click on the bell to stay on top of all the new live recordings that we'll be doing in the future. But as always, this will remain a podcast first and foremost. And that's the same as our motto, which is consistent as long as we're going to keep doing this show. So Mark, until you're transformed into a giant tarantula who I eventually squish in a great gory mess, what's our motto?
Wow, that's a graphic image, Dan. Our motto is, with great podcasts, there must also come the Amazing Spider Talk.
Two men who know the angles, uncover and untangle all the questions and the webs left out to dangle. Be in 1962, last Wednesday's